I'd like to call this meeting to order. The time is, 9:01 or 9:02? Okay, all right, thank you so much. First of all, we're going to start with the flag salute, and Jim is going to lead it for us. Thank you.
I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America,
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Alrighty. Good morning, everyone. Welcome, board members and guests, to Wednesday, January 26, 2022, meeting of the Placer County Transportation Planning Agency, Placer County Airport Land Use Commission, Western Placer Consolidated Transportation Services Agency, and the Placer County Local Transportation Authority. We welcome the public to in-person participation. In addition, remote teleconferencing participation is available to board members and the public pursuant to the provisions of Government Code Section 54953E due to the COVID-19 state emergency proclamation and recommendations for social distancing. There will be multiple opportunities throughout this meeting for public comment. After I open an item for public comment, those joining us by webinar can signal they wish to speak by clicking the raise hand button on the middle of the Zoom webinar window. If you are joining over the phone, you can press *9. Pctpa staff will call out individuals one by one who have indicated they wish to speak. For those joining us in person, you are welcome to come to the podium. We ask that anyone making a public comment state their name and city of residence. You will have a maximum of 3 minutes to speak, and we will notify you when your 3 minutes are up. If you experience technical difficulties and are unable to provide public comment during this meeting, please email your comments to Solvi Sable, our clerk, at ssabol@pctpa.net. Board action. Because this meeting is being conducted via teleconferencing, all votes will be roll call votes. Board members, we ask that you state your name prior to making a motion or second motion for the record. Once an item has been moved and seconded, I will request the clerk to call the roll to vote. Thank you. Actually, I was supposed to read it before the fact, so sorry about that. Okay. Is that all I have to read now, Mike? Okay, Solvi, would you take the roll?
Yeah. Broadway.
Here.
Burris. Clark Kretz. Here. Dowden Calvillo.
present.
Holmes.
Here.
Howdeshelt.
Here.
Joyner.
Here.
Jones.
Here.
Wilkins.
Here.
Okay, next item, AB 361, remote teleconferencing.
That'd be me.
Are you supposed to read? Good.
I am.
Good.
As you're aware, with AB 361, the board can continue to meet with the relaxed teleconference rules due to the state of emergency and the state recommendations for social distancing. The board needs to periodically consider the circumstances of the state of emergency and their ability to continue to meet safely in person under the state's social distancing recommendations. These social distancing guidelines have been evaluated and continue to warrant meeting remotely, and we ask that the board adopt findings to allow for the continued teleconference meetings.
Okay. Next item is approval of, pardon? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
To accept it.
Okay, do I hear a motion?
Yes, I will make a motion.
Dowden Calvillo, second.
Actually,
Okay.
we have,
All right, we'll take roll now. Broadway.
Yes.
Burris. Clark Kretz. Yes. Dowden Calvillo.
Aye.
Holmes. Howdeshelt.
Aye.
Joyner.
Aye.
Jones.
aye.
Wilkins.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, so moving on, we need approval of the action minutes for December 1st, 2021. Everybody review the minutes? Have a chance to review?
If there are no comments, I'll move approval of the minutes.
Joiner seconds.
Broadway.
Yes.
Burris. Clark Kretz. Okay. Dowden Calvillo.
Aye.
Holmes. Howdeshelt.
Aye.
Joyner.
Aye.
Jones.
Aye.
Wilkins.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, the next item is the agenda review. Did everybody have a chance to take a look at the agenda? Any changes, comments?
Madam Chair, staff has a couple comments, a couple changes. One is that with consent item G6, there's a slight difference in the amount of $6. So the agenda shows that Roseville's bike ped claim is at $637,108. That should actually be $637,102 as reflected on the claim on the consent calendar itself. So minor change in that. And then the other item is in relation to item O, which is the traffic congestion report. We would respectfully request that the board pull this item. The detectors on State Route 65 are currently malfunctioning, and we could not produce a accurate report, so we would ask you to defer this to the future.
Okay,
Madam Chair, I will move approval of the agenda as amended.
I'll second.
great.
Sorry, that was Dowden Calvillo with the motion, sorry.
Ian Broadway, second.
Okay. Broadway.
Yes.
Burris. Clark Kretz. Dowden Calvillo.
Aye.
Holmes. Howdeshelt.
Aye.
Joyner. Jones.
Yes.
Wilkins.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, now we will take time for public comment. Is there anyone here that would like to make a comment? Then anyone online? Okay, all right, seeing none, then we will move on to item G, the consent calendar. So, these items are expected to be routine and non-controversial. They will be acted upon by the board at one time without discussion. Any board member, staff member, or interested citizen may request an item to be removed from the consent calendar for discussion. Would anyone like to pull anything from the?
I have none.
No?
No.
Howdeshelt moves consent.
No address the public.
Dowden Calvillo, second.
And Sylvia, I assume we had no public.
No.
Okay.
No public comment. Sorry about that.
Good.
Okay. Broadway.
Yes.
Clark Kretz. Dowden Calvillo.
Aye.
Holmes.
Aye.
Howdeshelt.
Aye.
Joyner.
Aye.
Jones.
Aye.
Wilkins.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, item H, consent calendar, Western Placer Consolidated Transportation Services Agency. Again, these items are expected to be routine and non-controversial. They will be acted upon by the board at one time without discussion. Any board member, staff member, or interested citizen may request an item be removed from the consent calendar for discussion. So one is audited financial statements and TDA compliance report. Anyone have any?
I have no.
No?
No.
Anyone from the public?
Move approval.
I'll second. Broadway, second.
Holmes first.
Broadway.
Yes.
Clark Kretz. Dowden Calvillo.
Aye.
Holmes.
Aye.
Howdeshelt.
Yes.
Joyner.
Aye.
Jones.
Yes.
Wilkins.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, next item. I, consent calendar, Airport Land Use Commission, the ALUC. These items are expected again to be routine and non-controversial. They will be acted upon by the board at one time without discussion. Any board member, staff members, or interested citizen may request an item be removed from the consent calendar for discussion. Item 1 is a 9 a.m. public hearing, Airport Land Use Commission, Consistency Determination, Reasonable Accommodation Ordinance Zoning Text Amendment. Should we take those one at a time?
You can do them both
Okay,
together.
then item 2 is 9 a.m. public hearing, Airport Land Use Commission, amended rules of procedure for the Placer County Airport Land Use Commission. Anyone?
Madam Chair, quick question, if I may.
Yes,
It's Joyner. I'm unclear how we do a public hearing under consent.
Mike maybe can give us
Us.
some guidance or some.
David, why don't you go ahead?
Okay.
Sure. So we discussed this with legal counsel, and assuming, well, one, we advertised the item for public hearing, following the public hearing procedures identified in the ALUC Rules of Procedures. And the legal counsel said that as long as it's advertised as a public hearing, we can place it on consent, provided, and it can remain on consent, provided that the members of the commission and/or no members of the public ask that the item be heard. And so that's kind of where we stand with,
I move the item.
I'm not, did that answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay.
We want
Yes.
to just verify that we don't have any public comment.
yeah, I guess we should verify. Is there any public comment on either of these? No? Okay.
Dowden and Calvia will second, but I have a question under the motion, or actually under the item. So it's on consent, but are we opening a public hearing for the purposes of collecting testimony? And
No, we just need to ask if there's any public testimony per our legal counsel's advice.
okay, so do we need to do that before we adopt a motion, I presume?
And we did, and there's no public comment.
Okay, sorry, I
No, that's okay.
got a text. Thank you. Dowden Calvia second.
Okay. Broadway,
Yes.
Clark Kretz,
Yes.
Dowden Calvillo,
Aye.
Holmes,
Aye.
Howdeshelt,
Yes.
Joyner,
Aye.
Jones.
Aye.
Wilkins.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, moving on to item J, appointment of Capital Corridor Joint Powers Authority alternate representative from the PCTPA Board. Mike?
Good morning. As per is normal every year, the PCTPA Board has the ability to appoint members to its, to the Board of Directors of the Capital Corridor Joint Powers Authority. With Sandy Amara departing and switching back to an alternate member on the PCTPA Board, we recommend and the Auburn City Council concurred with the appointment of Alice Dowden Cavillo as the alternate member. So staff recommends the board approve the action as requested.
Okay, do I hear a motion?
Howdeshelt moves. Holmes seconds.
Okay. All those in favor?
Public comment.
Yeah. Oh, yes, do we need to open that up for public comment?
I think we have
Yeah, you do, yeah.
Okay.
no one on this
No one
end.
on this end, okay, good. Guess they trust us.
Broadway,
Yes.
Clark Kretz,
Yes.
Dowden Calvillo,
Aye.
Holmes.
Aye.
Howdeshelt,
Aye.
Joyner,
Aye.
Jones,
Aye.
Wilkins.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, moving on to item K. Yes, congratulations, Alice.
Thank you.
Item K, Federal Legislative Program for 2022. Take it away, Mike.
Thank you. Again, another regular item that comes up at the beginning of every year is where we examine both of our federal and our state legislative platforms. So items K and items L consist of those two platforms. We'll be taking item K first. And at the end of the discussion, we recommend that the board adopt the federal legislative program for calendar year 2022. This year's federal legislative program is essentially consistent with last year's program with a couple significant highlights. One of those is the passage of the new federal infrastructure bill, or the IIJA. This is the probably the most significant funding program on the federal level for legislation that would not only change transportation law, but also would change at the federal level, but also would change significantly the allocation of dollars towards different federal programs. I won't go through all those as there are many, but they are listed in the staff report. Our projects continue to focus on regional highway improvements and supportive of any the pursuit of any federal dollars for any local projects of any of our member agencies as well. The other item to highlight in our draft federal legislative program, again, looking at differences between last year and this year, is it is sort of a state/federal item, and that is that the state of California, with the passage of the federal IIJA, is indicating that they would like to have their stamp of approval on any federal dollars that we apply for. And so they've created a number of different committees through Caltrans and the California State Transportation Agency to use the lens of the Climate Action Plan for Transportation in terms of what local agencies and the state of California applies for and doesn't apply for. So that's a new twist this year on the federal process. In the past, it's always helped to have the state's recommendation, but they are seeking to make that a little stronger, and which can present somewhat problematic situation if we're not in agreement with the state, especially when it comes to our expansion projects. The other thing I'd like to highlight as I close my presentation is the annual cap-to-cap trip is reinstated in theory this year for the end of April of 2022. And then we typically send the chair of the commission or some other appointee from the PCTPA board in coordination with our member agencies. This last year we had the opportunity to also have a opportunity to address federal issues in Washington, D.C. with the Placer Business Alliance annual trip, which is likely to also visit Washington, D.C. in fall, although the details are not out quite yet on that. So those would be the two activities related to any visitations to Washington, D.C., unless there's a particular project that comes up that needs our attention. So with that, I would actually turn it over to our federal lobbyist who is joining us this morning via virtual means, Sante Esposito and Brian Esposito, and I'd open up to them to say hello and make any additional remarks. So, Sante, I think you're muted.
Just tap on your. There you go.
There you go.
Yep. All set. So thank you, Mike, and good morning. I'd like to begin by just giving a brief update on where the infrastructure initiatives stand in Congress. As Mike said, the bipartisan infrastructure bill is now law, having been signed by the president on November 15. It's Public Law 11758. The Build Back Better bills. First of all, on the Senate side, you've all seen the reports. You know, with the defeat of the voting rights bill and the filibuster reform effort, that pretty much sealed the fate of the Build Back Better bill, at least in the Senate as far as the House passed bill. So currently what's going on is discussions between the White House and Senate Democrats about next steps. The talk is about carve-outs. Now, what exactly carve-outs means, we don't know. At the end of the day, is there going to still be a mega infrastructure bill, or is there going to be a series of carve-outs? At this point, the Senate Democrats prefer the latter. The Speaker, however, prefers the former. She wants to keep intact as much as possible the House-passed version of the Build Back Better bill. And the House did pass its bill on November 19th. And that bill provides $4 billion, in part, it provides $4 billion for reduction of carbon in the surface transportation sector, $4 billion for affordable and safe transportation access, and most importantly, $6 billion for local surface transportation projects. So the bottom line is, with respect to the Build Back Better bill, it's still a work in progress. I'd like to turn back quickly to the bipartisan infrastructure bill. That bill provides funding from two sources, apportionment money and competitive grant funds. Apportionment money are the funds that go to the states based on various formulas. And according to the U.S. Department of Transportation, from the new law, over the next 5 years, California is to receive $29.5 billion for highways and bridges, $179 million for highway safety, $555 million for transportation emissions, $631 million for resilience projects, $10.3 billion for public transportation, $12 billion for intercity rail service, $5 billion for rail improvement and safety, $3 billion for rail grade crossings, and $384 million for electric vehicle charging networks. That's the formula program. Now, on the competitive grant side, those obviously are projects or programs that one would apply to the U.S. Department of Transportation. They're presumably merit-based programs. What the new law does is to provide significant increases in the existing programs and create some new programs. So just generally speaking, the law provides $29 billion for projects of local and or regional significance. And you can see from the slide that Mike put together that he's identified as a possible candidate for that, the 65 widening and the interchange. It also provides $15 billion for mega projects, which are multimodal, multi-jurisdictional projects of regional and national significance. And again, on Mike's slide, he's identified as the third track as a potential candidate for that. And it also provides billions for resilience, bridge safety, and electric vehicle charger grants. Now, in terms of timing, the latest from the Department of Transportation is that the applications for some of these will be solicited in the next couple of months. So we're going to be watching that to see what comes out of the department. And I also want to point out that on Mike's slide, he points out the partnership situation with respect to, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Washoe County in Nevada. That's a very important point because partnerships resonate in Congress. And partnerships also speak to the issue of regionalism and sometimes beyond that nationalism. So to the extent that any grant are pursued by the agency that involve partnership arrangements, whether it be with another county or locals or even multi-partner relationship, I think is a plus in terms of the politics as well as substance. Last point on grants. Grants are very competitive. They're also very political, especially in this this year. Grants are to the executive branch what earmarks are to Congress. And also in terms of the application process, it can be very timely, very costly, very effort-driven process. And so I would just suggest, once we see the applications come down, take a look at the possible opportunities, that we pick our fight very carefully, very strategically. We want to maximize our ability to be successful in the process. So a lot of choices, a lot of menus, and we'll just see what opportunities turn out to be fruitful. So I'm just going to, at this point, I'll stop before any questions are asked, and I'm going to just defer to Brian, who's going to talk very briefly about regulatory relief.
Hello. One of the policy recommendations included in the federal legislative program for 2022 is to seek relief from federal regulations on projects to improve the highway system that do not have federal funding support. In 2021, we sought and supported regulatory relief in the highway bill that became part of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Build Back Better bill efforts. So we will continue to look for other opportunities for federal regulatory relief. Secondly, for the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the new highway law codifies the Trump administration's one federal decision permit streamlining directive. That requires a coordinated effort by a number of federal agencies to complete the federal permitting process within 2 years. And that was Executive Order 13807. I'm sorry, 13807. And thirdly, for the Build Back Better bills, the House passed bill provides $50 million to the Federal Highway Administration for grants and administrative activities to facilitate the completion of environmental reviews for surface transportation projects. And the Senate Environment and Public Works draft bill also provides $50 million for the same purpose. So as I mentioned, we will continue to support these as we have and look for other opportunities for federal regulatory relief. Thanks.
In closing, staff would just highlight a couple other small things. One is the mega region project. So we're working with SACOG and Capital Corridor to pursue funding for the third track project. That's very important. And we have identified the CRISI program as a likely candidate for part of the funding of the third track project. Another aspect is along the lines of what Sante and Brian were talking about in terms of efforts related to any grant, especially the competitive grants that we would apply for. One of the tacks that many agencies have taken in the past is to sponsor a visit of U.S. DOT staff to the region, and hopefully with the variant calming down, hopefully in the summertime, that might be possible that we would be able to get some of the U.S. DOT staff from Washington out here to take a look at this, and this would have to be coordinated with the entire region to get that staff member or set of staff members to visit. And then lastly, in concluding, our master agreements, actually with both our state and federal lobbyists are up this year, so we will be sending out an RFP to procure a lobbyist on the federal side and on the state side this year. So, and that will be brought back to the board for final approval. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions the board might have on the federal program.
Okay, board members have questions?
I have just a quick question, and I apologize if everyone else may already know what the third track project is, but being new here, I don't know what that is.
Certainly, the third track project is a multi-year project that we Pctpa and CCJPA and our partner agencies, especially the city of Roseville, has been working on to expand Capital Corridor service from in the first phase from its 1 train trip per day to 3 train trips per day to Roseville, and then in the future we're looking to expand that to 10 trips per day. Those number of trips per day to Roseville is a requirement placed upon the owner of the railroad. Or by the owner of the railroad, Union Pacific Railroad, and that's why Roseville was the terminus chosen for that. It's about a $200 million project that we've received some funds for already, and we're pursuing the federal CRISI program, the state ITIP program, and other funds under the Solutions for Congested Corridor this year to fill that gap to meet the funding requirement of about $200 million.
So then expanding the Capital Corridor to Roseville for 3 trips per day and ultimately up to 10 trips.
Yes, and you know, we would like to expand that to you know, all the way up to Auburn at some point in the future. But at this point, Union Pacific Railroad, again, who's the owner of the railroad, would only let us go as far as Roseville. But we have high hopes that someday to go beyond that. And then also we are about to initiate a feasibility study of expansion of the Capital Corridor service all the way up to Reno.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Other questions by board members?
Yeah, Mike, we have 52 million set aside for that third track, is that correct?
We have about 80 million
80.
that we already obtained through the TIRSA program and Proposition 1A. And what happened is, since that was originally applied for, the cost of the project increased, unfortunately. And so we had to pursue additional funding, which is what we're doing this year. And that is one of the mega region projects. So not only is it supported by Pctpa and our member agencies, but also by SACOG, the San Joaquin Council of Governments, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission of the Bay Area, and others. So it's a huge effort to get that project across the finish line.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions by board members?
Just one more follow-up, sorry about that. So we're looking to expand to Roseville. Is it all the way down to San Jose, or is it, where is it on the other end?
So the third track project, the infrastructure needed is in this first phase is from essentially Watt Avenue east to Roseville. So it's literally a third track that we would be constructing. The second phase, which would be in the future, would then extend from Watt Avenue down into downtown Sacramento to allow the other 7 trips, hopefully at some point in the future.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, Madam Chair, one of the things that was very valuable for me when I got on the CCJPA board was a briefing with their executive director, Rob Padgett. And so Supervisor Holmes and I, we're happy to facilitate that, or Mike can facilitate that conversation with the executive director and Commissioner Dowd Cavial. I will be happy to send you kind of the briefing materials that they gave me last year when I joined the CCJPA board, and your head will explode.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Without a doubt, Rob Padgett would be happy to do that. I can speak on his behalf. So,
Any other comments or questions by board members? Okay, I guess we need to open it up to the public. No one in the public. I guess they trust us, huh? All right, so do I hear a motion to adopt the federal legislative program for calendar year 2022 as shown in this report and direct staff and federal advocates to represent these positions?
How to Shelp knows.
Second, Holmes seconds. And I just want to thank Santi and Brian Esposito for their steadfast leadership over the years, being the advocate for us on federal projects. They do a great job.
Thank you very much.
Okay, roll call vote, please.
Broadway.
Yes.
Clark Kretz.
Yes.
Dowden Calvillo.
Aye.
Holmes.
Aye.
Howdeshelt.
Aye.
Joyner.
Aye.
Jones.
Aye.
Wilkins. Motion passes.
Okay, moving on to item L, the state legislative program for 2022. Mike?
thank you. And the companion to item K is at the state level. So we have our annual platform for state legislative items. So after staff's report, we would ask you to provide direction to staff and adopt the state legislative platform. Again, this is for existing board members. This program is very similar in nature, and also focuses in on our regional projects and supporting our member agencies projects at the state level. So I'll hit some of the highlights of this program, and then Mark Watts, our state lobbyist, will say a few items to update us on his efforts. So again, we're supporting the same types of projects, our regional program. We also have significant efforts underway to, as we did at the federal level, to support streamlining of the California Environmental Quality Act and other permitting items. There's occasionally some items at the legislature to do that, and there's also items in the other direction that we have to be cognizant of and watch out for, so that they don't compromise our projects here in Placer County. Some of the key things that we're pursuing is the Sb1 program. Not only does that provide formulaic funds to our member agencies to fix it first here in Placer County, but it also provides a number of competitive programs, and we have to be diligent in the implementation of those. There are guidelines that come out every cycle of funding for those, and we have to work hard with various committees and groups, as well as our efforts with Mark Watts to ensure that Placer County and its member agencies are not put at a competitive disadvantage for those projects, and so that we craft our grant applications for maximum potential of funding. As you know, we are, the board adopted the Placer-Sacramento Gateway Plan, which was a congested corridor plan that David Melko and some of our other staff members worked upon a few years back, that was key to opening up the funding for that Solutions for Congested Corridor plan. There's 150 projects in there in both Placer and Sacramento County that we will be, each cycle will be applying for and positioning those projects for maximum funding potential. And this year we're guiding 3 or 4 of those projects towards the highest likelihood of success for both Sacramento and Placer counties. We continue to support the SACOG's Green Means Go program. For the first time, they've received identified funding for those items, which don't necessarily come before Pctpa, but they could. But their ideal is to maximize the reduction of VMT through those projects, and so we will be following that closely. There's a lot going on in terms of local transportation funds, or LTF, to both ease the restrictions on transit in terms of fare box return ratio, but we have to kind of be diligent in looking out that, again, there's nothing be put on those LTF funds that would restrict our use of those funds. So that's something we that is high on our radar list of monitoring and supporting or opposing. And then lastly, I would mention the third track project again, where we are going to be pursuing that through the Solutions for Congested Corridor program. And so that's again a mega regional effort supported by our state legislative platform. And also the Reno rail feasibility study. That is something that we are working closely with the state or Caltrans Department of Rail and Mass Transit to implement that program. We're very hopeful that they will finalize the decision. They've given us preliminary indications that they will fund that feasibility study, but it's not a sure thing yet. So we're working with CCJPA and our partner agencies to make that happen. Lastly, I'll mention that probably the biggest thing that we have to be cognizant and watch out for is the Climate Action Plan for Transportation. This is a significant initiative adopted by the governor and Caltrans and the California State Transportation Agency to reduce VMT, and it presents us a challenge with our expansion projects here in the county, namely the expansion of State Route 65 and the interchange at 80 and 65, and so we have to potentially amend those projects a little bit in terms of how they are positioned for funding, and also work with our regional agencies. Yuba County is working on a project to look at a bypass of the Wheatland area, and it would likely be in our best interest to work closely with them on the 65 corridor as an entire corridor, as opposed to each county working on its own. And so we'll be working with the staffs of Yuba County and the city of Wheatland and their consultant team to provide complementary facilities that hopefully meet the goals of the Pctpa program. So again, we can position those projects for the maximum potential for state funding. So with that, I will turn it over to Mark Watts, who is our state advocate, and he'll say a couple remarks, and then we'd be happy to answer any questions after that from the board.
Hi, thank you. Good morning, Chair and members. I'm pleased to be here today. I probably should have stayed home in Auburn instead of coming to Sacramento to talk to you on Zoom, but this is working well. I just have some brief comments to make on the platform, a little bit, maybe a couple sentences on the state budget, because there's potentially really good news in there. And then finally, I'll explain briefly the governor's gas tax holiday proposal, and I'd be open to questions afterwards. So with respect to the state platform, it is such a very helpful guide, and I think the staff has put together, even though it follows on to last year's programs, puts together a list that makes it worth or of value to guide my efforts in Sacramento. CEQA reform, if it comes up, I know I have the authority to start working on that and getting information for your consideration. The Sb1 implementation, I think I would point to the last cycle of the competitive grants to show how under the executive director's guidance, we were very successful in maneuvering and positioning the timing of that program, or of the competitive grant programs, to line up with the last election cycle. The fare box ratio for LTF, that is something I believe will be in the trailer bill language. We have not seen the budget trailer bill yet. We're all anxiously waiting to see what the administration puts together. And when I look at the state surplus of transportation, I'll touch on the budget briefly. So moving on to the budget, the governor, similar to last year, when the governor proposed a multi-billion-dollar supplement or plus up on the state budget using some of the surplus funds, he had incorporated general fund funding in the amount of in excess of $3.4 billion for a suite of programs to go along with his high-speed rail appropriation request. That all fell apart, as you know, and he's reactivated the request, but this year he's included another $1.5 billion. As a result, the total amount, if you include the high-speed rail appropriation, would total about 9.1 above the standard transportation programs. And I would just point out, I'm not advocating for, just point out that the high-speed rail funding comes from voter-approved Bond Act money, not from state resources, otherwise state transportation resources. So we're watching that very carefully. The plus up has a lot of potential. A number of regional agencies have sought additional money up beyond the amount that is in the budget, and the probably the complex matter to deal with in terms of getting an increase above the 9.1 billion is the fact that of the $45 billion overall state surplus, a big chunk of it goes automatically to Prop 98, and in addition, there's the complicating matter of how much of the tax revenues would be in excess of the GAN limit, which was imposed back in the late 80s, early 90s. And that GAN limit is a pretty firm restriction on appropriating funds. There are some exclusionary aspects, such as additional capital outlay. So that's being put into the mix here. And as these extra regional proposals come in, I think we'll start to see how this all interacts between the proposals, the GAN limit, and the overall surplus. And finally, just to mention, I think one of the highlights or lowlights or the confusing factors in the state budget is the governor's proposal to skip the annual inflation adjustment that was enacted by Sb1 that is scheduled to occur on July 1st, 2022. And then they would resume the adjustment in 2023-24. The amount projected for the increase this year, it would be 3 cents per gallon, in contrast to the last year's increase in the base price outside of taxes of over $1. So, you know, if you want to do something for Californians, I think there are other mechanisms that could be applied. The cost to transportation programs, if this were enacted, is about $520 million. And that would be shared equally between local government rehab and maintenance, and the other half would come out of the state rehab and maintenance. The governor is proposing that the local half be backfilled by an additional drawdown on state rehab and maintenance funding, which would mean the state Caltrans would bear the entire amount of the backfill. There are a couple bills, notably Assemblymember Kiley has a measure that would eliminate the entire tax for a 6-month period. So we've got a lot of activity going on in and around surrounding the budget and transportation revenues as we move forward, whether it's a decrease as I just described or significant increases that are the potential if the legislature and the governor come to an agreement. So with that, I would draw my comments to a close and prepare to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, questions by the board?
I do. On that last point, Mr. Watts, so it would be $520 million that would not be available if the 3 cents were increased. Is the governor proposing to use some of the surplus to fill that space?
No, he's not.
Additional questions? Board members? Seeing none, do we have any comments from the public? Nothing? Okay. All right, do I hear a motion to adopt the state legislative program for 2022 as shown in this report and direct staff and state advocate to represent these positions with electeds and agencies in Sacramento?
Move approval.
Second by Dowden Calvillo.
Broadway.
You're on a delay, Alice.
Oh.
Yes.
Burris.
Yes.
Clark Kretz. Yes. Dowden Calvillo.
Aye.
Holmes.
Aye.
Howdeshelt.
Yes.
Joyner.
Aye.
Jones.
Aye.
Wilkins.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, so we will move on to the next item then, line M. Update on a potential 2022 transportation sales tax measure. Take it away, Mike.
Good morning again. The item before you in item M is an update on our potential 2022 transportation sales tax measure. If the board recalls, we had reinitiated our efforts to look at outreach activities following the Delta variant impacts. So we went back into high gear following that and implemented our outreach program, which included events in the community and other activities. One of the things that we had done was to however, because of the impact of the variant, was to postpone our polling, which was originally scheduled for October, to push that back to just after the Thanksgiving holiday following Black Friday. And so we did that and then polled in the week after Thanksgiving and first week of December, as originally planned, or as planned in terms of the looking at the South County District. FM3, our consultant, who has done our polling for many years, went out and polled the 3 South County cities that would be in the district under the special legislation we got a number of years back, Assembly Bill 1413. And today we're here to report the findings of that. Those findings were presented to a ad hoc subcommittee of our board back in early December, made up of the representatives on our board from the South County. So that presentation was heard by them. Staff today will be recommending that we, as we're essentially at the same level as we were in the June poll, to recommend that we continue on in our efforts to April. That subcommittee concurred with staff's recommendation again back in December. So with that, I will turn it over to FM3, Kurt Balo, who many of you know. And Kurt will go through a rather lengthy slide presentation, and then we'll open up for questions on that presentation, and then our FSB Core Strategies team, Cherry Spriggs and Aldo Panesci will say a couple closing comments, and then turn it back to staff, and then open it up for discussion. So Kurt, take it away, and I'll advance slides for you. Just say next slide when you're ready.
Oh, okay, will do. Sorry, I'm gonna move my camera back. I was gonna do them on my end. All right, sounds great. Kurt Balo from FM3 Research, happy to present the results. We've gone through and gone through some of these results with many of you over the years. So let me jump into it. Mike, can you advance the slide? So I'm going to talk a little bit about just the methodology. It's very similar to what we've employed in the past. As Mike noted, we conducted interviews essentially over the first week of December. Respondents were allowed to take the survey on the phone or online, and we were focusing on the 3-city district. So this was just Rocklin, Roseville, and Lincoln. We conducted a little over 600 interviews. So the one key point here is that for the full sample, a 4% margin of error. That's probably the most important thing right here. Just keep that in mind. All right, next slide, please. So the first section I'm going to go through are just where voters' heads are in these three cities. So if you go to the next slide, first off, right direction, wrong track. The old Gallup question. You'll see that in this survey we just connected. The right direction numbers are at 55%, 28% wrong track. So a little more optimistic and pessimistic simultaneously from the survey we conducted last June. But we're still nowhere near sort of the more optimistic views that people had back in 2017 and in 2019. So a little more unsettled electorate here. Next slide, please. And one thing I want to point out as we're going through here is you'll see some italicized either subtitles or footers. And that's the actual language that we presented to the response to the survey, either on the phone or they read it themselves online. So in this question here, and we've got a couple slides in this series, is what problems do voters in this area feel like are the most pressing? And many of these are issues that you have no little control over, but we asked them to see where do traffic issues stack up compared to other problems, because we've seen in past research that there's a correlation between concerns about traffic and willingness to support a potential measure to generate funds to address that concern. So the scale we used here was extremely serious problem, very serious, or somewhat serious problem. The darker mustardy bars or the more intense reactions, we've summarized those on the right-hand side. If you click the slide once, Mike, I think you'll get a little dash line, yeah. So there was a clear top tier of items. And two of them were cost of living items, the cost of housing and inflation, where about 2/3 thought they were at least a very serious problem, and then drought was essentially the second one. So those were the top of concerns. Right below that line, you'll see traffic congestion on local freeways and highways, and that's really a critical one for us to be monitoring and seeing if voters are feeling that pressure and feeling those levels of concern. Couple items that here are just here for comparison points. Why don't we move on to the next slide? and you'll see this is the items that we're seeing as less concerning. So you start to see those bluish bars get a little bit bigger here. And the ones that are kind of relevant for us, in particular here, are the amount you pay in local taxes, which is the second item. So for a 2/3 measure in these 3 cities, you have 43% of the respondents here who indicated that they thought that was at least a very serious problem. So that's a key number to look at here. You'll see that traffic congestion on local streets further down the list, and even economic concerns were way towards the bottom of the list here, with jobs and unemployment being seen as a very serious problem, only about 1/3. Next slide, we'll go through some of these we've asked, or actually many of these we've asked in several surveys. You can see the variance over time. What's interesting here is that we've looked at the difference from the last June survey to here. And you'll see that most of these items haven't changed a lot. There's a little more concern about potholes, but it kind of looks like it's returned to where it was before last summer, so it's not a big change. Everything else looks pretty similar on this slide to where we saw it last summer. If you move on to the next slide, Mike. Thank you very much. You'll see that for some of these, though, the concerns have actually gone down 6-7 points or more. So the economic impacts of the coronavirus, that's gone down 6 points. Traffic congestion on local streets, that's actually gone down some 2. And the risk of wildfire. One thing I forgot to mention on the prior slide, Mike, if you can go backwards one, is that second item there, traffic congestion on freeways and highways. You don't want to see this, but if you're trying to look for indications that an electorate is more receptive to a potential tax measure, if you look back in 2019 and early 2020, we saw close to 2/3 who felt like, traffic congestion is a really serious problem here. Dipped down with the pandemic. People weren't driving, the freeways weren't as congested. It makes sense that it's gone down. We've had that little bit of a tick up from 55 to 58%. That is a potential margin of error difference. It could also be the big leading edge of those concerns ramping up. We probably need another data point to tell, but that's an important sort of contextual number to always be looking at here when we're considering viability. If you can go forward 2 slides then, Mike. Thank you. We asked a variety of other questions about traffic congestion, and we had to, in our prior surveys, we just asked this one in the bottom of this table saying, do you feel like traffic's gotten better or worse over the past couple of years? Gut feeling. We've had to make some changes to this question given the pandemic. The format we asked it in this time was similar to the way we asked it over last summer, so these are not perfect comparisons. But if you go to slide 10, next slide, I'm sorry, not your slide, my slide 10, you'll see the responses to this. And what is just really telling is those dark mustard bars. 70% of voters from 17 to early 2020 thought that traffic was getting worse. And that changed a ton during the peak of the pandemic. It has not rebounded yet. Those worst numbers went from 38% last summer to just 46%. So that this is one indication that it feels like the pain of traffic may be starting to come back amongst voters, but it's not nearly at those same levels that it was 2 years ago. Next slide, please. And so then we have been asking, do you feel like a more of a prospective question? Do you feel like traffic is going to get worse a couple of years from now? And this really has changed. So we started asking this 2 summers ago in June of 2020, and only about half thought, well, it's going to be worse 2 years from now. That was peak pandemic, a lot of uncertainty. Last summer, that had gone up to 65%, and now a full 4 out of 5 voters feel like traffic's going to be worse 2 years from now. If you click on the slide, you'll get our wonderful, fancy graphics here of an arrow going up. Go to the next slide, please, Mike. This is a new question that we thought we'd ask, which is, how do you feel traffic congestion, what kind of impact does it have on your quality of life? I think one of the things that all of us can reflect on, and many people we've always conjectured on, is that once people really feel that like the traffic congestion is having a material impact on their quality of life, they may be willing to put aside some of their misgivings about finance measures and be more supportive. This is interesting though. Right now, 64% feel like it has a negative impact on their quality of life. Close, but not quite at 2/3. A full third feel like it doesn't have much of an impact at all. And they may be just be because of their own personal driving patterns. But what's also interesting here is the intensity of that. Only 21% feel like it has a very negative impact. The plurality feel like it has a somewhat negative impact. This question will be very interesting to track over time now, because if we see those concerns about traffic elevate, it becomes a more pressing issue. We may also see the perceived impact on people's qualities of life also change. Next slide sorry. One more, there you go, sorry. On here, we have asked a question about people's economic anxiety, and do you feel like your personal finances will be better or worse? So the two big variables here that are independent of all the good work the agency does, but are sort of macro, is do you feel like traffic is bad, and do you feel like you could afford potentially elevated taxes? And looking back, so the traffic seems to be slowly starting to increase as a level of concern. Last summer we asked, well, do you feel like your household's finances will be better or worse? And about 2/3 said about the same, and actually more thought it'd be better than worse. That's kind of flipped a little bit. Still a majority feel like it would be about the same, but now that worse number has gone up to 24%, gone up 10 points. So those are two things you want to monitor: is people's level of economic anxiety or comfort versus their concerns about traffic. If you advance the slide, you'll see that really highlights the 10-point gain. All right, so I'm going to pause here, get a drink of water. That's the first section. Those are contextual questions about traffic, pessimism, optimism, and economic concerns. The next series of slides I'm going to go through somewhat quickly is just impressions of the pertinent local government agencies. The County Board of Supervisors, really not much of a change from where voters viewed them last summer. Next slide. The Pctpa, also not much of a change. I think one thing that we've noticed here is from 17 to the summer of 2020, there was more community and engagement and activity that the agency was undergoing, a lot more communications, and slowly those favorable numbers were just consistently ticking up. Pandemic hits, brakes get put on those types of communications, and it wasn't necessarily that the unfavorable numbers went up. This is that more people fell into those. I don't really know much about them, or I haven't heard much about them recently, sort of camp. So looks like maybe we're starting to see those numbers pick up again, but it looks like those communications had a material impact, and as soon as those communications stopped, for very rational reasons, then impressions of the agency changed. Next slide. Just going through the three different cities. Lincoln, impressions of Lincoln government, basically the same as they were last summer, not quite at the high water mark of 2017. Next slide. For Rocklin, overall favorable numbers look very similar to last summer, a little more intensity on the favorability side. And finally, Roseville, again, not much of a change here either. So that gets us to the next section, which is the actual ballot measure, which is what we're really focusing on here. So the next slide, if you can advance, is the hypothetical 75 words. We've all seen some version of this for a long time. Let's go on to what the vote was. So on this slide, you'll see respondents were said either read that 75 words or read it themselves online, and they're asked to indicate how they would vote. If they said yes or no, we pushed them, or you definitely or probable. If their initial inclination was to be undecided, we also pushed them a little bit and asked them if they're leaning one way or another. That gives us a breadth of different responses. And as you'll see here, support is at 63% yes. A few points short of that 2/3 vote threshold. We have some slides here coming up where we'll see that this is a pretty familiar level of support that we've seen. For a 2/3 measure, you would like to get obviously above the 2/3 threshold with all of your yeses, and you'd like to have your definitely yeses get to 40% if possible. Next slide. So this is the initial votes in a variety of surveys we've conducted since the last time something was on the ballot. And you'll see that those levels of support were higher in 2017 and 19, and have been in this low to mid 60s range from the beginning of 2020. So we're in a similar sort of state right here. The no's are a little bit lower, and there's a few more people in the undecided camp. So that may be where some of the movement is, but it's largely consistent with what we've seen in recent years. Next slide. I'm going to rip through some of these demographic kind of quickly, and my apologies. And if there's questions about them specifically, I'm happy to answer them. But as Mike noted, this is a long presentation. So Democrats more supportive than independents and Republicans, though majorities of all three types of voters express support. We also look at combinations of party and age, party and gender. You'll see that Democratic men are the most supportive, and younger Democrats. We look at this by voters of color and white voters, basically exactly the same. And you'll see that that right direction, wrong track number, that's come down some. The right direction numbers are down, and it seems to be important for us. And that's something that this agency has very little control over. But those who feel more optimistic about where the county is headed were more supportive than those who are more ambivalent or more pessimistic. Next slide. And these couple of slides are pretty interesting for us. So if you feel like traffic is worse now than it was recently, you're more likely to be supportive. You can see that pattern is perhaps not all that surprising. Next slide. If you feel like traffic congestion has a negative impact on your quality of life, you are also more supportive. So all those things make sense. We've seen that sort of dynamic in the past. By the financial outlook is interesting. So if you recall, we had a little bit of a shift from last summer where we saw more people in that middle category, but we have more people optimistic about their financial prospects than pessimistic. And that shifted now, and so there's a 24 to 18 on the worst, better side. And those who feel worse about what their financial prospects may be in the future are less supportive. So that is a countervailing factor here. All right, and finally, just getting into the cities, we've seen Lincoln voters consistently more supportive over the last few years, and that bears out here. Roseville and Rocklin, the 4-point difference here, there's a margin of error kind of difference. They've been largely similar positions, and you see this broken out by the 4 different districts. Obviously, we don't include District 5 in this particular area. All right. The next section here is we go through if this agency and all the other member agencies decide to put something on the ballot, we want to try to simulate what a community engagement back and forth would be on this measure to see how volatile support is, and it's helpful for determining whether something is viable or not. In this case, we went through arguments in favor, arguments opposed, and support dropped down to 51%, and those no votes picked up to 44%. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that we rotated the order of those arguments. So half the respondents got just the arguments in favor of a measure first, and then the negatives, and then half got the arguments opposed to a measure, and then arguments in favor. And you'll see that gives us a little bit of the ceiling and floor sort of feeling here. So if there was only negative communications in the community, it would flip to a majority opposing the measure. If it was only positive, we essentially do get up to that 2/3 vote threshold. Next slide. Another factor that we look at when we're looking at viability for something as well, how entrenched are these supporters and opponents? So maybe your support level looks kind of consistent, but it's masking a bunch of movement. Here it looks like we got a little less than half of respondents who to this survey said, yeah, I'd vote yes every single time we asked. I think that you'd like to see that number higher for a 2/3 measure. Conversely, only a quarter consistently voted no every time. For a 2/3 measure, if you had a third or more consistently voting no, that would be a much more challenging position. Here, there's just clearly a lot of volatility, a lot of response to this survey, and a lot of voters were moved around depending upon other factors they heard, information that they heard. And this might be the next slide, maybe one of the more important ones here is some historical context. So maybe if you could click once, Mike, you'll see that the last survey we conducted for the agency before it was placed on, Measure N was placed on the ballot was February of 2016. kind of in the same time frame we're almost now in the different election cycle. And that support in the initial vote was at 63%. We were only able to basically after positive, didn't push it up any higher. And after negatives in that survey, the support came down to 53%. We know what the outcome was. Pretty darn close, so 64% when something was placed on the actual ballot. We had different drawing of the boundaries where we had South Placer County, which included these 3 cities, plus some of the interconnected, stay on that slide for a second, yeah, unincorporated areas, and we had higher levels of support prior to 2020. But ever since, I mean, a lot of factors have changed when we got to 2020. We've been sort of in this same range. I will say 2 things here. The initial starting point looks very similar to the last several years. 66% is a couple points higher than we've seen. So ceiling is a little bit higher, but that 51 suggests the floor is a little bit lower. So a little more variance, which I don't think is necessarily surprising. Next section is just what were those pro and con arguments. I'm going to maybe, Mike, just for the expediency's sake, we went through a variety of these and we have little shorthand names for them. And let's go to maybe click one more slide up. One more after that, perfect. So we presented these in random order, and some respondents heard all of them, so not all of them, but we presented these, some to all of them, and sometimes we split sample just to not bombard people with too many arguments here. And the scale we used was something very convincing or somewhat convincing to vote yes in this case, and do the flip side in a second. So the most compelling arguments have been consistently specific improvements to the interchange, to 65, really getting tangible here. And in this case, the third item down here is just traffic in general. You'll see that when we talked about the quality of life impacts as a rationale for supporting a measure, that was less compelling. And maybe that's somewhat reflective of that, what kind of an impact does it have on your quality of life question as well. Making an economic argument also was a lot less compelling than really just getting at traffic is bad, we need to fix, and here are ways that this measure could help address that. It's part of a long-term plan that we can get a hold of matching funds. Let's go on. We have some critical arguments here too, and maybe skip 2 slides ahead, and we'll see what the impacts of those were. One more, perfect. So same sort of scale here, convincing reason to oppose the measure. Right off the bat, you'll see a couple of these have more intensity. More of those respondents thought there were very convincing reasons than the positives. The number one most consistent criticism has always been, shouldn't the gas tax be, or the VLF increase be paying for this? We've seen that over and over again, and it's a very compelling rationale to oppose the measure. Some of these we've tested in prior surveys, like the fact that maybe developers should be paying for this, and then all these problems are caused by poor planning. These are all sort of just things you may hear out there, or just generally too many taxes. One of the new ones here was we got a misspelling on federal, my apologies, but the federal and state funds, basically that there's a lot of federal and state money sloshing around out there. Shouldn't we use that money first? And you heard a little bit about some of the limitations of that from your prior agenda items here, but that was a compelling criticism as well. The last couple substantive slides is a new question we haven't asked in the past, which is where do people get their information from about local news and local issues? So we asked respondents to indicate, do they get information from this source frequently, occasionally, rarely, or never? Just to kind of get a feel for what are the best communication outreach channels. Word of mouth, right at the top of the list. Always one of the more compelling ways to get information out there, but obviously it's diffuse and it takes resources to do. And local television news, the most affordable of all these communication channels, obviously, but way up there on the list as well. Social media, still, it's not as, you don't get as much reach than others, but you're still in that 42% or at least getting information from radio and social media as well. We asked about the B, which not a lot of voters are getting local information from there. And if you go to the next slide, we did ask about a local newspaper in each of the 3 cities. And you'll see that in Rocklin and Roseville, those newspapers. A lot of individuals said they don't get much stuff from them about local issues. It was different in Lincoln, actually. About half said that they pay attention to that publication. So that gets us to final conclusions here. If you go to the next slide. So first thing here is traffic. It's up to 58%. They view it as an extremely or very serious problem. It's not quite where it used to be, but it's starting to creep up to 2/3. Next item here. I think this is one of the more interesting numbers for the longer term prospects for a potential measure is basically 4 out of 5 think traffic is going to get worse. We did not see that level of pessimism a year or two ago, and now people are, maybe they're not feeling quite the same pain, but they feel like it's a looming problem out there in the future. Next item here is we've got this 64% feel like traffic congestion impacts their quality of life negatively. When that number starts getting more above 2/3, then that will be an indication that it's causing more pain. So traffic congestion in prior surveys was one of the very top items that people are concerned about. It is in a second tier now, behind some cost of living issues, the drought at the time. It may be starting to tick up that list. And there seems to be this level of concern that it will become a more salient issue. The economic concern is probably the other side of that scale. If concerns about traffic go up and people feel like it's a big part of their quality of life and it's having an impact, that's going to make them potentially more supportive. We have all this data to suggest that. But the flip side, if they feel more economically unsettled, that's going to be working in the opposite direction. So we want to see how those big macro issues are developing here. So what does this mean? Next slide here for measure of viability. So right now we're at the 63%. We've been here before in prior research and before a measure was last placed on the ballot, just a little bit short of 2/3. Next item. We get to just about 2/3 after just hearing some positives. So our ceiling is by just a couple of points higher than it's been in the past. And finally, after going through pros and cons though, our floor is lower. So kind of in sum, Mike, if you can hit it one more time. We're sort of in the margin of error of that 2/3 level and we've shown a little bit of higher ceiling. But after pros and cons, and there's some new cons now, the things that weren't on the table several years ago, it does fall down lower. So we're sort of in a very similar range that we've seen in the past, with some inklings that there may be a higher level of support if some of these macro factors change in the future. That is a whole lot of me talking, and I don't know whether, Mike, you want me to pause for questions or maybe Cherry and Aldo to add some of their analysis and thoughts.
Maybe Cherry and Aldo first, and then questions.
Great.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Good morning, Chair and members. I'm first going to ask Aldo, do you want to go with your commentary first? Do you want to follow up after mine? Aldo, you get to choose.
I'll just follow up after you. I just have a couple of comments.
Okay, sounds good. So yes, thanks everyone for having, well, I guess I'm not there in front of you, but thank you for providing me the virtual opportunity to be here in front of you today. So when we saw these numbers with the subcommittee, it's funny, I think I've told you all, I live in Lincoln, and I never like seeing that my fellow neighbors or community members are getting grumpy sitting in traffic. Like, I don't ever want that for anyone, right? But in this instance, we are trending back in a direction where we had seen pre-pandemic. We all know, that traffic is back, right? And we're starting to see that. I think people are really starting to understand what that is by the 3 data points that Kurt shared in the presentation, that people are starting to feel this. People are starting to think that this is going to be even worse in the future. And I think that's really important, for all of you that are serving these constituencies to really be paying attention to this. One of the things that I've looked at over the years is, where are we? When you ask folks, what's the top issue that's keeping them up at night? Pre-pandemic, right? We did capture that first spot in terms of traffic and congestion and whatnot. And then we kind of found ourselves in this situation in June where, quite frankly, it dropped all the way to number 10. And that's not a good place to be in, because your community is having to figure out all of these other things that they're, the challenges of the world. But here again, you see, okay, people are starting to feel this, people are starting to live with whatever it is that the pandemic ends up being for us in our future. And now they're starting to get back into their lives and they're, wow, this traffic is getting bad again. And what's this look like? And so while we're not back to number 1, we're certainly much farther up the list than where we were at 9 and 10 back in June. The research really has been critical, and your board all voted for us to be cautious and to continue to check in with constituents, which has been very, very important because, whether you're looking at 63, the 66%, it's safe to say that nearly 2/3 of people in Roseville, Rocklin, and Lincoln want to do something about this. This is a problem, right? And you have to listen to that. And so as we continue to do this research, it helps us in terms of our
You're frozen, Jerry.
I think,
Aldo, you want to jump in?
yeah, I'll jump in. I think Cherry froze. So maybe just to continue along those lines, the research that we've seen over this period of time from Kurt has been very helpful in the sense that we're, can track the economic anxiety. I guess the couple of slides that were the most important to me were discussion of economic anxiety that we have to monitor, and obviously, the pandemic as things improve. So that's why it's helpful to us to kind of monitor those things. I do, what I was going to mention, I mentioned previously in some of these discussions, is that things are in flux and it is a dynamic situation and it continues to change all the time. And so that's why it's helpful to monitor it. I'll toss it back to you, Cherry. I see you're back on.
Thank you for jumping in to save me. It's always one of those things where you never know that you're unstable until you hear somebody else talking saying, oh, we can't hear or see her.
No.
But that is where I was going with this. We continue to find issues that we know that we need to talk about, right? I've talked to you all about, okay, things that we need to address, development, the gas tax, all of these things. As Kurt pointed out, a new one that we have to think about is inflation, right? That's something new we've never had to think about before. But on the flip side of that, another reason why the research has been so wonderful is something like matching funds. For several cycles now, we really tried to hammer home the idea of matching funds and that we're missing out on state and federal funds because we don't have this. Matching funds now is one of, 64% in terms of a message where it hadn't been that way before. It was one of the ones that felt was a little lower on the spectrum. So, when you look at the research and we're doing this cautious check-in and trying to understand as best as we can in an ever-changing environment, it really does prove to be invaluable. And then lastly, I think it's worth noting that, I don't ever want to say, oh, I'm so pleased that people are, sitting in traffic and getting grumpy about it like I started my commentary. But for what we were hired to do and what your task is these numbers are again trending in this direction where people are starting to feel this, and it's affecting the the goods and people and services movement and everything that you're all responsible for. So from my perspective, I was pleased to see that this still continues to be something that we can help change for our community.
Thank you, Cherry and Aldo. So in concluding, staff is recommending that we kind of stay the course to our next polling point. As I've discussed in the staff report and talked to many of you about, we're either in for a sprint or a marathon. We have a strategic deficit in transportation funds, which is especially evident in the south part of the county, but really countywide. And there is no other course available to us to fill that deficit other than a sales tax or even worse, a parcel tax. And so we recommend moving ahead towards this next April poll and doing the outreach necessary during that time. It is with the Omicron variant, it's not easy. We don't know whether we can do events or not, or we may have to do some kind of, hybrid drive-in theater type of event. We have to be very creative in these times. But we're not certain if 2022 is going to work or if we have to push to 2024. We just have to wait and see. We do know, though, now through this research and where we've been that it is of great detriment if we turn off things. So if we just go dark, that we drop significantly in terms of people's recognition of this issue. And then we also have an issue that we need to always explain, which is the role of the development community in this, in the funding of transportation programs. There is a rising sentiment that that the development community is not paying their fair share, whereas that's incorrect. They are paying for roughly 2/3 of the cost of these improvements, or the maximum allowed through the Mitigation Fee Act. So we need to consistently explain things that could be misperceived. So with that, staff will conclude and our consultant team will conclude our presentation. We'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Okay, we have some discussion. Yes.
Your mic is still.
I saw it on earlier, it disappeared. I'm pleased to see that this polling is continuing, considering how volatile our situation is. I have a couple questions, specifically on the slide that were up there. The margin of error, is that included in those numbers? How would one frame that? Is that a message?
Yeah, so it's a 4% margin of error.
Right.
So, technically speaking, that means if you conducted the survey 100 times, 95% of the time, the results would be within 4% of these numbers.
Okay. And then just a couple of observations. One, just maybe suggestion for the next polling round. When talking about traffic, one thing that I've noticed over the last couple years is aggressive driving has increased incredibly. My new son that just got married to my daughter, he's a CHP, and incredibly bad problem. So I think about traffic myself, but also those aggressive driving situations happen so often now. I feel like it might skew the numbers a little bit. I don't know, because when you have that happen, it's not fun to go through. The other thing that I would say is, with the economic anxiety as part of the issue here, that is something that can change somebody in an instant. And so how is that measured with your stats? Because, something could happen with the stock market, almost immediately, or something like that. How do you sort of measure that in terms of your factoring?
Kurt, you want to go ahead and take a crack at that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty hard to predict what the impacts of a more significant economic downturn or upswing would be, other than I think we've got pretty good correlative data that suggests that when the economy is doing well, there's more likely to support a measure. I think that we saw that the economic argument, like this is good for jobs in the economy, wasn't particularly compelling. I feel like the concerns might be, if you're trying to read through this a little bit, it may be that the overall economy voters were not as concerned about. It's more about the impacts on themselves. And if you think about the top couple items on the concern list, they were cost of housing, inflation, so more things that are personal. And I think that's where we want to look at stuff, is just if there's something, the bigger unemployment numbers and those things feel like they're a little more stable, feel like they're trending in a more positive direction, and voters don't seem as concerned about them in this area. It's going to be more of the pocketbook issues that we want to monitor.
Right, like the price of meat. I mean, it's incredibly high, and it's getting higher and higher, and it's literally one trip to the marketplace to the next that you realize that this issue is happening. So that's what I mean by such a very fast impact, that any type of, price increase across the board would have on a voter. Thank you.
And I would add, just for the point, and Mike and Jerry can add on to this too, is if a city or school district wants to put something on the ballot, they have to do so 88 days in advance of the election. you have a longer runway. You have to make a decision earlier and go through the process of working with the different government agencies, which does leave a bigger window of time for different things to occur. So that's just something to factor in your decision-making process.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah, Madam Chairman. On your slide that says sources of news and information, I had a question regarding that. Well, first a general question. Are you able with the polling to show on a map where the results came from? And the question is proximity to baseline, proximity to 65, proximity to 80. Are you able to do that?
We have everyone's address from the voter file, so we could do some analysis like that. It's a little, yes, we could do something.
Sure,
like that.
because if you've got a cluster of Sun City, Roseville, or Sun City, Del Webb, right? I'm sorry, Sun City, Lincoln Hills, you know, that'd be fascinating to know. Then with respect to sources of news and information, I'm hoping you can help me. It's interesting to me to see that friends and neighbors and coworkers are really high, yet social media and next door. So is that folks gathered around the soccer field or the baseball diamond versus folks gathered around their lap? It seems to be in conflict as far as sources of information.
Kind of what that tells us is what messaging resource we would use, you know, whether we would, you know, the thing about word of mouth leads us to that events may be more effective than, say, you know, something on Facebook or Twitter. So it helps us guide where we put our funding outreach investment. I don't know, Sherry, if you want to add anything more to that.
Sure, yes. So I think to your point, we can't really tell from that question if, you know, I'm with my brother at a soccer field and he tells me about some traffic congestion, and I say, oh my gosh, wow, I didn't know about that. We definitely need to get a measure on the ballot, versus my brother posting about it to social media and how I interpret that. I don't necessarily think that we know that, but Mike is right. It really does help us, especially in this ever-changing environment, get a sense of where people are getting their information from, so we can take the resources that you all have invested and do the best that we can to reach everyone possible. So for instance, when I look at this, I don't think I will ever come to you all and ask you to approve a full-page ad in the Sacramento Bee for this measure, right? I'm not doing that. But I'm looking at many of your faces right now, and I'm glad we're all in agreement. But you kind of get a sense of what I'm saying with that. We really use this to try to best predict where we can educate residents in Placer County.
Well, thank you. Thanks for that. And the reason why I was wanting to explore that a little bit more is in the city of Roseville, we just had a resident landowner vote on a community facilities bond that had expired, and Nextdoor blew up over it, and it went down, 66% of the folks voted against it, even though it was $130 or $260 impact on them. So it's very similar in the amount that we're looking for in a sales tax measure. And so that's why I was trying to distinguish between, Cherry, you and your brother, who may or may not be of similar mind, and something that that happens on Nextdoor, whether it be transportation related, financial, or the homeless issue. So thank you. Oh,
yeah,
and
no, completely. I understand that for sure. And I think that's one of the things that's really important to our team, that we are every place that makes sense and being good stewards of the taxpayer funds that we're using with this education program to make sure that we are educating everyone, but paying attention to the places where we really need to be.
And the last thing is, have you thought about using social media in a more granular way as influencers, right? You've got somebody who's recognized in their neighborhood, a realtor or somebody like that. Have you thought about that as a campaign strategy?
Yes,
Yeah.
we are.
So we have done some of that with the, I think there were 14 outreach meetings that many of you participated in last spring, and that's why we really wanted to have the influencers attached to the outreach meetings to help garner as much community feedback as possible. Because Bruce, you're exactly right. There's a lot of wonderful folks in our community that when we can work together, kind of that word of mouth situation, but it's in a digital forum, that really does help amplify the work that we're trying to do.
Okay, please.
Thank you. Question for Mike. Can you remind us what the cost is of an additional round of polling and what the kind of cost is of the ongoing public education efforts?
So the first question is, how much does each poll cost? It's approximately $40,000 for each poll. And then the cost, including those polls, for this program, since we re-engaged this effort over a 2-year period, is about $1.5 million.
Okay. And so the reason I ask is I think the question being asked of us as a board today is, do we want to do another round of polling in April? Do we want to continue our public outreach efforts until that point in time or not? I think the staff recommendation is that we continue with it. I'm doubtful that, given the numbers that we saw where any kind of organized opposition would put us down in the 50% range in terms of likelihood of passage. I'm doubtful that the numbers are going to move enough between now and April in the positive direction that we would have a level of comfort of placing this on the ballot. So it's speculation, but that's my suspicion. So then the question for me is the value of another round of data that's 4 months in the future from the December data, combined with ongoing public education efforts, is it there or not? I don't know. I know we've got a lot of data, and it's like every 3 to 4 months for the last year and a half, which is I think more than would be customary for an effort like this. So from my perspective, like I said, I would be surprised if the numbers move enough that we would collectively feel comfortable putting this on the ballot for this coming November. Could be wrong about that, but that's just what I'm speculating. So I think as I'm thinking about this, it's more from a standpoint of, is this next round of data and the kind of trend line information we would get from it valuable enough to spend the $40,000 and continue with the public education. So, it's not, I'm not sure about that. So I just throw that out for consideration.
And I guess one clarification of staff's recommendation is, or add on to that is, our recommendation, although it's immediately for, we're probably half spent through that 1.5 million, so we probably spent half of that already. Do we spend the rest of it through the end of the year? But I think staff's recommendation is even beyond that. If we decide not to go in 2022, staff's recommendation is, past this will be to do this for the next 2 years. And I think we've seen in the polling that you can't stop. You can't go dark and then start again, because when we do that, that recognition just goes off the cliff. So I guess staff's asking, do we go forward to April? And then with this recognition is that in order to be successful, and there is this strategic deficit in transportation, you're probably going to have to do that for a very long period of time.
When that being the public education.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, so it's either 4 months or 24 months.
Right, and that's where we're spending significantly more money.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
It is in the current OWP, by the way, so this 1.5, or the half of it is in our OWP. It's also, the 3 cities and the county have contributed toward revenue towards that as well, so.
Okay. Any other board members have comments or questions? Mike, do you have, oh, you, oh, you have,
Yes, we have one member of the public, but.
oh, okay, well, that's okay. So you're asking if, staff has recommended that we just sort of stay the course.
Yes.
So in other words, we won't poll another time before,
No, we would poll another, we would
oh,
poll
we
it.
would poll.
Where we would go from here is that we would continue the outreach until April. We would then poll at the beginning of April. We'd bring those results back to you at the April board meeting at the end of April. If we were at a point where we said, yes, let's move forward, we would then in May go to each of the city councils and town councils and board of supervisors, say, okay, we're ready to go. Do you concur with our expenditure plan? That's required by state law that we do that. And then it would come back to the board then in June, if a majority of the councils, and with a 2/3 measure, it's really all of the city councils and the board come back and say, yes, we want to do this, then the board would have in front of it an ordinance to put it on the ballot at the June meeting.
Okay, if, just hypothetically, if we don't go forward with it on this, for this cycle, this election cycle, will we continue the outreach and keep the public informed and still?
That would be
keep
staff's recommendation.
the idea?
You know, I think we would pull back a little bit in the level. You know, we can't afford a $750,000 a year level.
Right.
We can't afford, in the past, we've looked at something about $300,000 or $400,000 a year.
Right.
That's probably what we would do. We can't, well, we can, but there's a detriment of going down to no level.
Right.
So
But
if the board were to say in April, no, let's wait until 2024, staff would then be, and actually we already are, preparing our preliminary overall work plan to recommend that next level for next year, which would be somewhat less than the $750,000 a year.
Right. Well, we can't let it disappear, that's for sure.
Right.
Okay.
Chair.
No other comments? Yes?
Mike, remind me, half a cent is how many cups of this a year?
A half a cent measure, according to HDL, our sales tax consultant, and our team, a half-cent measure, given the population of South Placer County, would equate to $5 per household per month, which is about a cup of coffee.
It's kind of about, yeah, okay.
About a latte, maybe, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I don't need those lattes. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, if no other comments by board members, let's go to the.
Madam Chair, I did have a
Okay,
quick question.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Is April then really the latest that we can conduct that last poll to determine whether or not to go on the 2022 ballot?
Unfortunately, yes. Kurt Balow kind of hit upon that, in that we have cities and the county we can get closer to the election before a determination is made, but really July 1 is the deadline set by the county registrar to have a measure into them. So, and given that we have to go then after that poll, we have to go out to, and it takes about a month to go out and ask all the town councils and city councils and board. That really, and it's about the same timeline as last year. Certainly we could, if the board so chose, we could have special meetings and that type of thing. But if you went on our regular schedule, April would be the last time we could get that polling information to you.
Thank you.
Okay, and please.
It was the same question.
Okay.
So, yeah, I had basically the same question. So I sort of concur with your thought process on that, with the polling being so close coming up. It seems unlikely to have a vast change, especially if it's so equated with our coronavirus. And it feels like that's going to come, hopefully, down to more of a level that we can operate in the summer. So I feel like the timing is just really bad.
It's not ideal.
The government's not helping us out much either with inflation. Okay, we have a comment by the public. Okay.
Peter Eklund, you're free to speak.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, I have two comments. I think the first one is the polling doesn't seem to make any differentiation between what kind of congestion it is. There's a lot of data throughout the country saying that the local traffic has increased significantly during the pandemic because there are people at home. And in some cases, the peak hour is no longer the commute periods, but is the noontime period. And I think it is useful to try to get people to understand that some of this money will go towards local projects too, and by local projects I also mean transit. But I think it would be good to get data from cities on their major arterials to see how the traffic has changed. For example, Douglas and Roseville Parkway and Sunset maybe. You'll get some up-to-date data to see if there have been any changes, because I think that would be a big deal to show people that it's helping local travel. The other thing I think that is important too is that if there could be an organized group against it, I think you need an organized group in favor of it. I think you need a grassroots committee to work with outreach, and they can be educated about it, and they can show up at shopping centers and maybe have some meetings on their own, but these would all be volunteers, but they would be the people who are in favor of it. Businessmen, individuals like myself would be willing to donate the time and has a background in most of the projects. Do something like that. Engage with the people directly. Polling doesn't necessarily do that. Do it, but let's get out there and engage. And I think that easily can be worth 4 percentage points, and it isn't that difficult. If you had 10 people doing that from Roseville, 3 or 4 from Roseville, Rocklin, and Lincoln, you could cover a lot of shopping centers and other major places. Anyway, those are my 2 comments.
Thank you. Bruce?
Yeah, wow, I didn't ask Peter to call in and get inside my head, but he's exactly right, because there is a spillover effect. I'll use myself as an example. I make a decision about Antelope Road on 80, whether I'm going to get off on Riverside and weave my way through the city of Roseville to get home, or whether I'm going to continue on to the 80-65 interchange, because traffic is also is not as bad. So there is a spillover effect, whether there's a direct benefit to arterial projects that are paid for in our master plans in our city or not, but there's definitely a spillover effect that certainly needs to be, that there is a benefit to the community as a whole. And I certainly am sensitive, and I know there's a visceral reaction to, whether it be 12 cups of this a year or 1 tank of gas. I understand the visceral reaction to taxes or fees, right? But I think the value, personally, as I look at the value to the community, right? The value, when I weigh this out, and Dan, thanks for bringing up the cost of the polling. Mike, thanks for reminding us it's in the overall work program already. But when I look at that cost versus the potential value, it seems like every day, then whether it's the television news or the Bee, has increasingly stories about how 99 or 5 suddenly have come to a stop for hours because of an accident. We need to have a resilient transportation system, and we need to give ourselves a fighting chance in Placer County for things like the Placer Parkway, improvements to 65, and other things like that. So just wanted to add that to the conversation as we figure out, I guess we would have to amend our overall work plan if we were not to go forward with the staff's recommendation.
We have a amendment number 2, which would be, if you wanted to tell us to stop, we'd stop today. But in terms of the OWP, we would amend the OWP, and the normal time frame for that is in May, which is right near the end of our fiscal year. But if you tell us to stop today or not do something today, we'll stop today.
And Mike, I'm sorry, and
No,
sorry to
no,
go
no.
on. In addition to surface transportation, some of the sales tax measure could be be used for multimodal. So, it could be used for pedestrian and bike
Yes.
connections.
And our expenditure plan includes a significant amount of dollars to both alternative transportation, which is bike ped, and to transit. There's again quite a few dollars in there, commensurate with the type of area that we are, a suburban community,
Which could have a benefit for climate resiliency.
Yes.
Okay,
So
thank you.
I would say just short of a third of it is for those uses. So.
Thank you, Chair.
Yes, you're welcome. Another comment?
Yep, thank you. So I'm going to vote in favor of this. It would be helpful when staff comes back and the consultant team in April, if we could also get a summary of whether we think there's organized support and or organized opposition that would be likely with a measure like this. I'm working from an assumption that the population is large enough that there's a reasonable likelihood of organized opposition, but I don't know that, and you all know Lincoln, Rocklin, Roseville much better than I do in terms of what the likelihood of that is. I would be very surprised if the polling comes back and makes us all feel comfortable that this is the right time to go to the ballot box. I think that a self-help sales tax for Placer County is very important, and I'm definitely supportive of that concept. It seems like the data is currently pointing towards the fact that the majority of the electorate agrees with that, but a supermajority of the electorate may not agree with that at the time. So I hope I'm wrong, and I hope April polling information comes back and proves me wrong, and that there is a significant jump in the numbers. If that's not the case, I think a strategy of how do we plug forward over the next 1 to 2 years with probably a reduced level of public education and trying to position for a 2024 election does make sense. So with that, I'll stop. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you.
I would point out that there is and there has been an organized support group for this, and it's kind of as Mr. Eklund pointed out, the types of people, those are the types of people that are monitoring this very closely. They tend to get more organized when it's close. When we would put it on a ballot, then they get very organized and formal and form the necessary entity to do that. When we're kind of in this education process, they're a little more loosely organized. And then in the past, we have not yet, including on Measure M, had a group against. But that's not to say that we couldn't. There just hasn't. Just giving you a history, there hasn't been. So.
Okay. Yeah, and I think trying to guess that would be
hard,
significant given the significant swing that potentially could occur. 15 points was actually pretty dramatic. I was surprised that it was that significant, so, you know. Okay, thank you.
Alice, did you have a comment?
Yes, I just wanted to say that I agree with Member Wilkins on that. I don't anticipate there's going to be a great change in the polling, but I do respect the fact that we need to continue with that public education, and having that gray area is not a positive thing. You know, my gut tells me we're probably moving into 2024 anyway, but I will support this at this time.
Okay, any other comments? Yes,
Thank
Jim?
you. I just want to build on Director Roosevelt's comments about other alternative ways to get to where you're going. I live in North Auburn, and I know that I'm not going to get on Highway 49 at 8 o'clock in the morning, and so I take Mount Vernon. And conversely, when I'm heading out, I know I'm not going to get on Highway 49 between 4 and 7 o'clock because of the same route. I'll take the alternate highway, Mount Vernon Road. And then when I'm down at the materials recovery facility, either on business or for a county issue, and I'm coming back, I have to decide, am I going to get on 65 to hit 80, or am I going to take Sunset? And depending on what the traffic is, I'll take Sunset, because not only is it maybe, I don't know if it's faster, but it sure as hell is safer. And so anyhow, I just want to give you those comments, and I am supportive of moving forward with the staff's direction.
Any other comments? Okay.
Go ahead, Paul.
I'll just keep it brief. I just want to align myself with Dan and Alice. I think that they both perceived this correctly. Dan framed it very, very well. We've been tracking this for a long time. I don't see any significant shifts that we can expect in the next few months. I wish it were otherwise, but it's not. I also have some concerns about the future. Quite frankly, Lincoln has an agreement with the county on a tax sharing agreement that's going to cause us to put a ballot measure on the ballot for 24. So there will be those competing interests in the future as well. But I think staff's recommendation is the correct path forward, and I'm going to support it.
Okay, any other board members? Do you have any members of? Okay, any other members of the public? I would like to just make a comment, Mike. I know we were talking about other modes of transportation, and I think maybe an education to the public might be helpful on this whole issue, because I've found, since being a supervisor, a lot of constituents, they automatically go to the, what are you hiding? You know, what are you hiding from us? Or the old bait and switch and those kinds of things. So if we can get ahead of that, when we talk about asking people to come out of pocket and pay money, even though this doesn't sound like a lot of money to come out of pocket, and it's sales tax, so, you know, it also depends on how much you shop. So the idea is when we talk about congestion on the roads, and we need to solve the congestion on our roads. But when I hear about solutions to the congestions on the roads are maybe in bike trails or jogging trails, and so I know this is an extreme, but I'm thinking that who is going to either ride their bike or jog from Lincoln or Sheridan down if they have to work in Roseville? And the same way it goes, you know, for any other thing. So does that really solve our congestion problem? Or and I know the state demands that we do things like this, so it's not so much that it's even an option for us. But I think if we can educate the public as to what this will do to solve the congestion problem, what are we doing specifically with this money? So people have their ideas of what their, you know, dollar value. Is this worth my money? You know, what you're going to do with it. But if you're not open and honest with them as to specifically what you're going to do with it, in the back of their minds, they're always thinking, well, I wonder what they're hiding from me now, you know? And once you get us to vote yes on it, are you going to bait and switch it and use it for something different? So I just think it might be included as part of our outreach education to get some people, more people to buy in, that it's actually going to be the solution to our problem.
Yeah, we've found that we need to be very real and talk about real projects, as the polling has indicated, as opposed to, well, this set of monies for this type of mode, it has to fund 65, or it has to fund 80. And, we did those 15 public workshops out there, which many of you participated. And, we were expecting some change, frankly. Staff was thinking, well, maybe that we need to put some more money towards transit. And the answer was a resounding no. Stay the course with your expenditure plan. And so our outreach effort and everything else is kind of geared towards, 2/3 of the dollars go into roadways, and 1/3 of it goes to other things. And so, but we need to continue, you're right, we need to continue to do that, but I would just say we've done that, and we'll keep doing that, and having events where we listen to people and take their input and change either messaging or change our expenditure plan, so.
Right, okay. So do we have a consensus by the board on our recommendation to staff?
We would just ask, our recommendation is that you just continue the effort as planned in the overall work plan.
You need a motion?
Yes, we do. It's an
Yes.
action
Yes, sir.
item.
Yeah, move approval.
Okay,
I'll second that.
all right. A roll call?
Broadway,
Yes.
Burris,
Yes.
Clark Kretz, Dowden Calvillo,
Aye.
Holmes,
Aye.
Howdishow,
Yes.
Joyner. Joyner?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you now.
Aye.
Jo- Jones,
Aye.
Wilkins,
Yes.
motion passes.
Okay. Moving on to item N, Surface Transportation Block Grant, STBG, and Congestion Mitigation, pardon me, and Air Quality, CMAQ, 2020 Funding Cycle Framework. So I guess Rick Carter is going to present this for us.
Morning, board members. Rick Carter, your Deputy Executive Director. As you may hear in my voice, I'm dealing with a bit of laryngitis. And so if any time during the presentation you have trouble hearing me, please let me know and I'll see what I can do. As mentioned, the item in front of you is a framework for the upcoming funding cycle. It's some changes from our past practice and kind of a subtext of what's here. This is coming because of some directions we've had from the Federal Highways Administration. And SACOG is having to prepare a response because of those Federal Highway comments. And so kind of a subtext of this is that this framework would be incorporated into SACOG's response to Caltrans and ultimately to FHWA. Kind of important kind of background to this. Next slide, please. So in terms of background, Pctpa programs the federal STBG and CMAQ funds for Placer County, typically on a 2-year cycle. The STBG funds, again, that's Surface Transportation Block Grant, those are typically about $5 million a year, and they're eligible for a wide range of roadway type projects. The bulk of that in the county goes toward pavement maintenance type work, but it's eligible for other things, traffic signals, safety, a whole wide variety. The CMAQ funds, congestion mitigation, air quality are about $4 million a year, and those are very specific to air quality improving type projects, often used for transit, bike and ped projects, occasionally some congestion mitigation type work like roundabouts. It also funds things like Spare the Air program and freeway service patrol. Pctpa adopts guidelines with each cycle. The last cycle was 2 years ago. It was about $29 million, programming about 3 years worth of funding. So it's an important source of funds for agencies in the county. Federal and state codes describe how these funds flow from FHWA to Caltrans and then to the MPOs like SACOG and ultimately to individual projects. and those codes describe who may select projects and how those projects are selected, which kind of gets into comments from the feds. FHWA does random audits around the country. In 2020, they audited a couple of agencies in the state outside of the SACOG region. They identified some non-compliant processes within the state. Next slide, please. So FHWA notified Caltrans of those non-compliant issues. They are requiring some corrective actions of Caltrans, and they gave them an October of 22 date. Caltrans then met with all the MPOs, including SACOG. PCTPA was part of that meeting to kind of go over those corrective actions, and they have mandated a response date of February 15th that is from SACOG to Caltrans, because again, the funds flow from the state, from the feds to the state, to Caltrans, and then down. So they have overall responsibility, Caltrans does, to ensure that those funds and those processes comply with the federal requirements. I would note that there are numerous agencies in the state that are contesting some of FHWA's interpretations. CalCog is kind of spearheading that effort. That work is very much unresolved, and I point that out because we do have this February 15th date to respond. We don't expect to have resolution of these issues by then. This will be something that will be ongoing, I think, over the next year. So as part of this process, PCTPA did an internal review, and there are some changes that we need. So we are updating, in response to that, we're updating our framework for the funding cycle. Again, that framework has been coordinated with SACOG, I note, as well as El Dorado County Transportation Commission. They're in the kind of the same situation that we are. So we have, all three of us, been working together on the response to the feds. And so the framework that's before you today would be incorporated into SACOG's response to Caltrans. And I'll point out that the framework is a kind of general overarching document. We would come back to the board with detailed funding cycle guidelines at a future meeting. Next slide, please. So there are two findings that are really pertinent to PCTPA with some kind of subparts to them. The first is regarding sub-allocation. Code states that we cannot sub-allocate funds to an individual jurisdiction using a formula unless the formula can be tied to considerations addressed in the metropolitan transportation process. So what that really means, the real implications to us, the first is the funds that we program. So the state uses a population formula to identify countywide shares. That's actually prescribed in the state and federal codes. That's what they are supposed to do. PCTPA has historically programmed those specific dollars identified by the state. One of the things that FHWA has said is that that is a precluded sub-allocation, and we cannot directly use those funds. This is one of the things that is being basically challenged with FHWA and kind of the larger CalCog coalition, but there is no resolution to that at this point. So what we are proposing in the 2022 cycle is to program those shares as we've done in historic practice, because this will take place before the October basically deadline. But future cycles would be subject to the FHWA outcome. Working with SACOG and trying to figure out how to resolve this, what SACOG has proposed is establishing a target range with future rounds, including the funds that would be the PCTPA share, similar for EDCTC. This is, it's a bit of concern for us and the change from the past practice, but frankly, if the FHWA interpretation holds, we don't see any other real route. We think this is the best route forward. This is kind of what's identified within the SACOG response to Caltrans. The other implication is You cannot use a population formula to identify city or county chairs. That's considered going to an individual jurisdiction. Next slide, please. So the other finding was in regards to project selection. What the feds noted is that only the state DOT and the MPO have project selection authority. So essentially the SACOG board needs to take a specific action related to the selection of projects for funding. This has historically been done just by the Pctpa board. SACOG has, taken action on projects within the MTIP, that sort of thing, but nothing directly tied to the funding using these funds. So again, working with SACOG, our solution to this is that the Pctpa board would identify projects for funding, and the SACOG board would take action confirming that selection that would likely occur, assuming the timing lines out. With the projects for all 6 counties, I do think it's important to know that SACOG and James Corliss, the executive director, who will be available for questions at the end, has specifically supported our continued role in project and selecting the projects. He's noted that Pctpa knows the region best, they know the needs best, and is in support of us continuing to select projects with the SACOG board voting at the end to make that official. Next slide, please. So there are, in reviewing our process, we did note some other kind of recommended changes. Federal code includes this, basically states that project selection is based on priorities in the MTP-SES, must be done in accordance with the Metropolitan Transportation, or the Metropolitan Planning process. FHWA has rather detailed guidelines for the process for CMAQ projects. What they have for STBG is very general. We've identified in looking at both of these that there are opportunities for us to strengthen the documentation regarding project performance and selection for both those funds. Would include some additional application responses related to performance and improving records of project selection. Next slide, please. So to get into the details of the actual framework proposal, in regards to funding levels, Pctpa would estimate our funding levels for the 22 cycle based on the state apportionment within Placer County. Again, this could be different in future cycles. It all depend on the FHW review outcome. Pctpa historically has identified what I'm referring to as sort of off-the-top amounts that would go to specific projects or programs. In the last cycle, funds went to certain regional important projects like the South Placer Transit Project, went to the Highway 49 Bike and Ped Project. We typically also set funds to programs like Freeway Service Patrol and Spare the Air. So we would do that as we always have. So we would subtract those funds. What we'd end up with after that is a single value of a balance of funds that were available to local agencies to apply for funding. Next slide, please. Other part of the framework change is getting a little deeper into the performance criteria. We would define the performance metrics in the program guidelines. We'd also revise the applications to improve performance documentation. Another change is looking to incorporate SACOG's project performance assessment tool output into the applications. This is something SACOG staff had recommended that we do. I have ample years of experience this in my prior employment working in the SACOG 4-county program for a decade. That performance, the PPA tool, it's quick and easy. It's an online kind of GIS-based tool. You can go in and basically highlight your project location, input a couple of pieces of data. It literally takes 1 or 2 minutes, and it generates a slew of performance data that would be kind of uniform across all the projects. It pulls up kind of things like accident data, miles of bikeway that are nearby, it looks at congestion levels, job and housing data. So we think there's an opportunity to get a significant amount of data at essentially no cost that would aid the projects, but also help in identifying project performance benefits because of just the data that's readily available. Next slide, please. Last part of the framework, we're looking to change our application forms. Historically, we've identified the responses that are required for the programs, but not an actual form. Both SACOG and El Dorado County have a pre-made form, sort of fill in the box. We have a working group of Placer County agencies that are working on this funding round. So we've talked with them, presented a kind of a draft application form, also worked with them on the performance measures. That process is sort of ongoing, but they do sort of appreciate a simplistic, easy to fill out form that's clear. So that's one of the changes. Also looking to tweak somewhat the evaluation team. We're looking at something in the neighborhood of 3 to 5 members. This would include 2 staff at Pctpa. SACOG has asked to be included as a member in the performance review. They have done this for many years with El Dorado County, and El Dorado says it's worked well and added value. So we're looking to add a member of the SACOG staff. We've also considered the potential of doing something like perhaps trading sort of review work with El Dorado County and have one of their staff help with us and one with them, but none of that's really worked out. So that's to be determined. So that's the kind of the intended evaluation team, and that would help us document the evaluations just for the record. The last part is the project selection. As I mentioned, the Pctpa board would adopt a list of projects for funding, and then the SACOG board would adopt that list as well. Again, likely with the whole 6-county group. Next slide. So next steps, assuming adoption of the framework, SACOG would incorporate that into the responses that are due to Caltrans by the 15th of February. Caltrans then has to respond to FHWA, kind of go through their review process. There is a sort of a federal deadline. They want the statewide compliance with the FHWA action by October of this year. As I mentioned earlier, there's an effort to work with Caltrans and FHWA to resolve some of the concerns we have with their comments. So that would be ongoing. I did briefly mention we have coordination with the Placer Agency kind of working group, working through funding estimates, program guidelines, selection metric criteria, application forms. So that would continue with our process, and we would return to the Pctpa board for approval of those items. And then the last little item, Pctpa has an MOU with SACOG that kind of broadly covers our relationship. Part of that MOU does cover some of the issues around the funding round. So we may need to come back to both boards, potentially with an addendum because of the revised framework. Next slide. There's a schedule for the funding round. I'm not going to go through it in detail. What we are really looking for is to have the funding round process completed by September so that we're done in advance of the October deadline. Part of the thought with this is we need to be in compliance after October. If FHWA has any real issues with our process, they will let us know, but the process that we're working on now, if it's not in sync with exactly what they want, we just have it done prior to their deadline. I do show a March date for our board to come back with fund estimates and guidelines. I will say it's a very tight schedule. That may bump a month, but I do have some float kind of in July. So if that does happen, I don't expect that to really impact the ultimate dates. And then last slide. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. I will note that James Corliss, who is the Executive Director of SACOG, is also available to answer questions.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
I apologize. I have an 11:30 meeting down in Rocklin that's been scheduled for about 3 weeks. I just want to know if you're going to have, if I leave, is there a quorum? And will there be a quorum for the South Sparta meeting? Yes. Already? Okay, I apologize. You know, it's pretty busy in my world. But I would ask the board to adjourn this meeting in memory of Lee Bastian. You may have noticed that Lee isn't here. He passed away earlier this month. Lee was a proponent for public transit to Sheridan. Came here all the time. He was always waiting in the front before we started the meeting. He was also a great supporter of 4-H for Placer County, particularly the Placer County Fairgrounds. And there is one of the animal barns is named in his honor at the Placer County Fairgrounds in Roseville. So if you'd be kind enough to adjourn the meeting in his name, I would appreciate it. Thank you very much.
You bet. Have a good day. Okay, do we have comments, questions by board members? Yes, please.
I just want to kind of make sure I'm understanding the issue. So for Rick, so it sounds like we've had a method of allocating these funds amongst the member jurisdictions for a long period of time that's worked well for us. The feds through Caltrans have come in and said we need to change that method, and staff has worked with the member jurisdictions to come up with a new method that we believe will meet the federal requirements, for lack of a better term. And I see there's Technical Advisory Committee meeting minutes in our board packet where this item was discussed. Is it fair to assume that the Transportation and Public Works staff of each of the member agencies have been involved with developing this proposed method of allocation and maybe aren't crazy about it, but are determining that this is the best they can come up with, or that we can collectively come up with for the time being?
I think you've stated that very well. We have been working with agency staff, public works staff. This was presented to the TAC, and there is, like, as I mentioned, there's a smaller working group, and they find, I think that the catch is this is not what they would prefer, but they do think that this is a method that they can accept and work with.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, comments?
Comment, if I may, Madam
There's
Chair.
Paul. Yes, go ahead, Paul.
Dan, once again, nailed it. So I'm not going to cover that ground again, but you got it exactly right. What I will share is that my ongoing concern here, first of all, I want to thank James and his staff and Mike and his staff for the hard work they've done on this. We've been wrestling with this for several months now. My lingering concern is that at the end of the day, if we don't handle this right, that Placer County and El Dorado County wind up in a 6-county competitive funding round down at SACOG. And we're not going to come out better for that process. So I don't know that I have a question. I want to share that concern. James and Mike, if you can address something that might help us alleviate those concerns about that potential future, it would be helpful. I've been at SACOG long enough to see how difficult the 4-county round can be, and I'm worried.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
I see Alice has her hand up.
Thank you very much. My comments are really aligned with Member Joyner on that too. I will say I do appreciate the amount of work that staff and the staff of all of our member agencies have put in to come in to develop this particular proposal. It's not an ideal situation. It's unfortunate that we've had to succumb to these changes at the federal level, but you know, it is what it is. And I do appreciate that we at least have some method going forward. And I am very hopeful that we will be treated fairly, and that we won't fall into the scenario that Member Joyner mentioned. I sat on SACOG many years ago, 98 to I don't know, but so I recognize that and I'm very cognizant of it as well. But I do want to say thank you to staff again for coming up with this particular proposal for us.
Okay. Any other comments?
Yeah, just quickly, and I agree with everyone who preceded me, and as I described my commute to downtown Sacramento earlier, you know, there's multiple, it's mutually beneficial for SACOG, for SACOG, El Dorado, and Placer to work together for the benefit of our citizens and our commuters.
Okay. Okay, are there,
Chair,
oh yes, please.
I'll jump in with the remaining board members and appreciate, Paul, your comments specifically. I think one of the primary concerns is ensuring that the residents of Placer County and the citizens of our communities continue to receive the funding. One thing California has done, California doesn't always do things right, but this is an example of where things have been done right, specifically through our agencies and how funds have been utilized for projects that specifically benefit our communities. This is disrupting that, and it's being applied simply because it's a nationwide application of the federal guidelines that have been established for this. My greatest concern is that Placer County, our cities and towns, would be negatively impacted on the funding that we receive. That is where we look for Mike and James to work through this, your staff members to come up with a process that ensures that we continue to receive that funding, because the last thing I want to see happen is we have to start looking at a different approach so that we can align with the federal process where we would have more of the decision-making made available to us. I think we've got a good process that works. I think we work well as an agency along with SACOG, and I'd hate to see us have to consider making even greater changes to provide us with the ability to ensure that those funds continue to be received. So just wanted to mention that, and again, I appreciate the time that's been put into this, working with the TAC specifically, knowing that they're in alignment with this and feel it works best. Not the best solution, but it works best based on what we have before us. So again, thank you, and I look forward to additional information coming to us on how we work through this. Thank you, Chair.
Oh, you're welcome. Okay, I guess we'll move to public comments. Is there anyone out there? No? Okay, well, last chance for board members. Okay. All right, so we are being asked to approve the proposed framework for the 2022 funding cycle for STBG and CMAQ funding. We hear a motion?
Joyner moves approval.
I'll second.
Gowden Calvio, second.
Take it back.
Okay.
Maybe give it to Alice this time. Okay.
Broadway.
Yes.
Burris.
Yes.
Clark-Kretz.
Yes.
Dowden Calvillo.
Aye.
Howdeschelt.
Yes.
Joyner.
Yes.
Jones.
Aye.
Wilkins.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay. Maybe I should have mentioned for the record earlier that Supervisor Holmes had to leave for another meeting. Okay, we're not going to address O since it's been pulled from the agenda, and going down to P, Executive Director's Report.
Thank you. And given the late hour, I'm going to keep this very brief. One is that we had to make a change to the Freeway Service Patrol program to temporarily eliminate the Sunday service and service truck, also known as the Atom truck, through fiscal year 2021. This is done because of the inability of our contractor to, which is actually an area-wide issue, to provide adequate labor to staff those. And this was the best method given the data for those days. to contract service. We are going to be monitoring this activity on a monthly basis, and at the point where we can restore that, given the ability of our contractor to hire people, we will restore that service. I also wanted to point out that we have a new project manager for that program, Solvi Sable, on our staff, who actually used to do it, has retaken over this activity with the help of David Melko, the prior project manager. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, and then we have a short video for you, a very short video, is that we have a new staff member who some of you have met already, but I wanted to welcome Mike Costa, who replaced Kathleen Hanley on our staff, to have him come up and say hello and introduce himself. He'll be working on many of our key issues here at PCTPA.
Great, welcome.
As Mike mentioned, I am the new Senior Transportation Planner for PCTPA. I'm very happy to be on board. Just a little bit of my background. I actually recently came from the city of Elk Grove. I was their former transit system manager there for a few years. And then prior to that, I had some experience working down in Modesto for the Stanislaus Council of Governments. So I'm hopeful that my experience both at StanCog and also my years as a transit planner / manager in Elk Grove will contribute to my new role here at PCTPA, and I'm very happy to be on board. So it's a pleasure meeting all of you officially, and if you have any questions, please let me know.
Questions by the board?
Welcome. Questions, welcome.
Yes, just welcome. Thank you.
Thank
Glad
you.
to have you on board.
Thanks, Mike. And then lastly, we have a short video. We are the marketing arm for Capital Corridor for Placer County. And we just finished a new video to actually attract people to Placer as opposed to people using it to go from Placer to the Bay Area. So a little different. So Jeremy, if you could roll that video very quickly.
After almost 2 years of being at home, it's time for an outdoor adventure. If you're looking for a car-free and bike-friendly experience with a great mix of local eateries and activities, what better place to explore than Placer County? With daily direct service from the Bay Area to Auburn, the Capital Corridor is the best way to get up to Placer County for a long weekend. Just hop on the train and leave the car behind. For your overnight stay, check into one of our many delightful hotels like the Park Victorian, located a short bike ride away from the Auburn station. Once you've finished settling in, be sure to enjoy some of the local cuisine, like Tap and Vine, which is a must-visit in Old Town Auburn and is just a short walk away from the Park Victorian. After a refreshing night at the Park Victorian, start your Saturday morning right with breakfast at Edelweiss Restaurant. Hop on the Auburn to Light Rail bus for a quick trip to Rocklin. Board the bus at Auburn Station, Nevada Street, and take Route 10 to Rocklin Road at Sierra College campus. Then, walk over to Quarry Park Adventures and let the fun begin. Quarry Park is the nation's only adventure park built from a former rock quarry. You can paddleboard, rappel, and rock climb, and there's a one-of-a-kind play area for the kids. After a day in the sun, wrap up your visit by going just around the corner to Straw Hat Pizza for dinner and catching the bus home. Sunday morning, grab a cup of coffee and a delicious croissant from the Poor Choice. Then, catch the Auburn Transit Shuttle at the historic firehouse in Old Town Auburn to be taken straight to the American River confluence for an all-day mountain biking or hiking experience. After your exciting day of mountain biking, kick back and relax on the Auburn Transit Shuttle back to your hotel. Once you've had your fill of outdoor excursions, head over to Old Town Auburn, which is filled with delightful antiques, galleries, locally made goods, and much more. Finally, wrap up your weekend trip with dinner at Auburn Ale House, which offers a wide selection of tasty meals and seasonal beers. After a fun-filled weekend, use the train ride home to catch up on some Z's or post your adventure on social media using the free onboard Wi-Fi. To plan your next Placer vacation, visit the Capital Corridor website to see the train schedules and check out Visit Placer and Quarry Park Adventures for your next car-free getaway.
So this is one of, features two of our communities, Rocklin and Auburn. But we would continue to work with Visit Placer to use this avenue to actually bring more people to Placer County and benefit the Placer County economy. In the past, again, we focused on the commuter to the Bay Area. We'll still do that, but this is kind of a new tack that we've taken, and it's working very well so far.
Very nice.
With that, that concludes my executive director's report.
Okay, any board direction to staff? Alice, Paul? No? Seeing none? I guess I'll just move on to let people know of informational items in the packet. And also want to make note that our board meetings are typically held the fourth Wednesday of the month at 9 a.m., except for in November and December. Those meeting dates are slightly different. Those can be found in the board packet as well. So, is there any other business to come before this body?
Just to adjourn in Mr. Bastian's.
Okay. Yes, let's adjourn this meeting in honor of Lee Bastian. Is that okay? This meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.